Right, friends, are we ready?
Might be.
Right then, friends. Good morning, all. The speaker today is Jenny Smith, and those of us who have been here before know what an interesting time is ahead for us. So today, Jenny will be speaking on something called Underground. Spooky, eh, what? Jenny.
I was a little embarrassed about the title that I heard before, but it's made me think a lot. And I'd like to go back before I came to Bristol, because I think that there were things that I knew that maybe some of you didn't. I knew that as D-Day was announced, that the authorities went through the prisons in this country and gave the chance to prisoners to go and join the fighting men and go to a war with the rest of the people, or stay in prison. And I know that some of them took it up because I came across one in Germany, and he was in charge of all the vehicles for the unit. He'd had 5 wives, and he was known for somebody that you could go to through the back door and get things that you couldn't get anywhere else, or perhaps most of us wouldn't even bother to try and get. And I have wondered over the years how many of those people that joined the armed forces from the prisons actually still were there, as he was years and years later, doing a job, being liked by most people, but most people were extremely careful with him. Now, thinking about that recruitment, some of those might have finished their time in the forces and gone back into communities all over the country. And I did wonder about that as something that might have stimulated some of the knowledge that the people who carry out illegal acts, especially the violent ones, might have learned tricks from soldiers from. And it might have been ordinary soldiers also getting involved. It's just something I always remember. I would also remember we had a Greek landlord in Cyprus, and my husband went off with the keys to the house, shut the house, and left me and the babies to come home to a locked house. And I said to the landlord, give me a sheet of paper and something to poke. And he watched me while I picked got the key out of the back door onto a piece of paper inside the kitchen and pulled it underneath the gap. And he was a policeman in Berengaria. And he said, how did you learn about that? And I said, I don't remember. I just always knew that you could pick and get into people's houses like that. And I did wonder afterwards whether it was just the school I'd first gone to, which my mother took us away from. There was certainly a lot of knowledge there as well. And things like that you pick up without even thinking about you picking it up. And some of us decide never to use it illegally, and others decide to make a living from it in some way. As you know, in the 1970s, I worked and helped with the setting up and getting the money for the St Paul's Advice Service. A lot of homeless people came there, including Owen, who I was very, very fond of. Owen taught me some of the traditions, and not only did they go into skippers and squats that often burned down, unfortunately, because they seemed to get full of rubbish and people weren't careful when lighting fires in them. But he also taught me that when they were short of money, what they used to do was go down and walk through the shops, think Debenhams was called Debenhams in those days. So they'd walk through Debenhams, and if they picked something up, they'd take it back to St Paul's and flog it. And if they hadn't got anything by then, they went through Marks and Spencer's and then the Co-op, and systematically just found something that would provide enough money for food and for maybe some cigarettes for them. So I learned the tricks. Now, the other thing was, if you got caught, you went into Bridewell police station and they gave you a night in prison while they did the charges, and you got fed and kept warm, and you were out of the rain. So it paid sometimes to actually get caught as you were doing that. So I was beginning to learn that the other side of life that existed for Bristol. This is going to be not to a datal order. I just wrote loads and loads of notes down. I was friendly with Fleur Luce, who still exists and lives in Hotwell's area. She was a health worker. And when I watched that sitcom on TV about health workers going into poverty areas in the East End of London, well, she was doing it in Knoll West and Bedminster. She had a very upper class voice, talked about them as poor little dears, and they loved her. They let her into their community. And people like that are invaluable. She dragged me into housing and got me visiting properties in Knoll West that have been jerry built. They've been put up very, very fast. And during the time, towards the end of the time, she was moved from one health place and came down to St John's Road to work. But during that time, she and I picked up that there was an awful lot of drug dealing going on in Knoll West. And what was really worrying both of us is when the police did a raid on what houses we knew were actually drug dealing, they found nothing. At the time, I was on the police authority, and she and I came to the conclusion there had to be a mole in the police force for the houses to be absolutely and utterly clean when they went in. So I asked after a meeting to talk to the Chief Constable, Raven and Somerset, and he had room. I told him that we thought that they got a mole that was inside their police force in Knoll West area. At Broadbury Road it was though in those days. And he picked up the phone. I heard him speak to someone the other end. He said roughly what I just told him. I don't know what the other person said, but he said, stop everything, we'll bring outsiders in. And that's how one of the ways Knoll West drug dealing was cut short for a while. I think it went on again afterwards, but at least for a while it stopped. The other thing I remember is going into the tower blocks in Hartcliffe. I did canvassing before that in the 70s in that tower block, so I knew the tower blocks well. And then I had to visit this family. And this is going to be a bit of housing coming in, because once you start thinking about the past, all sorts of little things wander in that you thought you'd forgotten a long time ago. This family were a young family that were in about the 5th or 6th floor up. They had cracks in the walls. They had cement falling and holes. And I couldn't understand it, because those flats were built not too long before. They shouldn't have had that. Anyway, I reported it, told the city council that I thought it was dangerous. that it seemed to be happening on other floors. As I went down, I walked down the stairway to see whether there was more of it. And about 2 or 3 years later, the tower block was blown up, everybody having been taken out of it. And something that I'm sure you don't know, and I didn't know at the time, there are such things as ants, which are called Pharaoh's ants, that eat cement, and they come from Egypt. And because, I assume, because of the war and because of the travel that we do nowadays, somebody brought them back to that tower block, and they were having a lovely meal there. So it's my fault if one of the tower blocks got knocked down very, very fast. The prefabs in Southmead, I went to them. One of them they pulled down as I arrived to inspect it. The tenants had said, Jenny Smith's on her way to inspect this. And suddenly they got offered another place and they went like lightning. Yeah. There was an awful lot, but in other areas of the city, there was an awful lot of bomb damage in places like Windmill Hill area, yeah, especially near Hill Street. And the bomb damage really hadn't been repaired properly. Hill Street, I remember, in Totterdown. It's where all those steep roads are that take the exhaust pipe off of cars if you're not very, very careful. And I went into this house and saw mum with children. And I asked to see the rest of the house, which health visitors didn't do in those days. Most people who visit families in their homes go into their sitting room, which they keep nice because that's where the public see them, and they don't go into the bedrooms. But I was inspecting, so I was up in the bedrooms looking at the damp. The front bay window of the house was trying to walk down the hill. It was moving itself away from the front of the house. So there was definitely need for massive work to be done there. But what I also noticed was the children's beds, you could almost see through the blankets that were on the beds, they were so thin. And she really hadn't got any of the normal things you will get in bedding in any house for families to live together in. So I tipped off the powers that be, and some arrived like a miracle. And I know that Margaret Hodgson, who was a Quaker attending, came to meeting with me. She was wonderful. And I said to her one day, I want some sheets. And she said, I never get sheets. And then she rang up and she said, I went home and they're on my doorstep. And I thought, well, you've either done it yourself or a miracle's just gone through. But it was lovely. And we were able to provide all sorts of things, and we got the health visitors in with the family, and we ensured that they got proper benefits as well. I could give work away to other people. I always said that I found work for others in Bristol. And the front bay window got repaired and made sure that it wasn't going to walk down the hill like that. Went in parts of the city that other people don't go into. I was attending CND marches and demonstrations. I come from the Newbury area, therefore, and as some of you know from one of my previous talks, I was there the day that they had their accident there that hit the place where they'd stored some of the nuclear warheads, which could have been extremely nasty. So I think one of the things that life's done to me is open doors that other people haven't seen. And I think that strengthened me. And you get a lot of understanding of how people cover up is in their life because they're entitled to their pride. And I think handing back pride to people, letting them take back control of their own lives. I've always thought that my job had always been to walk in, sort out the mess and go, hand them back control of the whole world themselves. And I was at the same time during the 80s, I was helping Fred Morehouse with the young children, taking them off from Quakers and taking them out. And that's why one of them decided to get into the Brompton beam engine and go up the tunnel into the chimney. We had to sit beside her in the car, the van coming home, and she stank of soot everywhere. Often wonder what happened to her. She was a lovely girl. And it meant that I was seeing lots of bits of life that I would never have seen if I just sat at home and watched television. I also discovered, looking at my diary for the beginning of the 80s, and it reminded me, I was for 2 years on the national executive for the Labour Women's Council of the whole of Great Britain. And one of the things I had to do was try and get them to work as a team together, because some of the women on that didn't like other women on that. And we were there to do a job, and the job had to be done. Quite interesting, the difference in personalities that you come across. I lost 2 friends in 1983 who I valued greatly, and I think friends should remember them always. Albrecht Turk, who was in charge of community relations for Quakers nationally. He was wonderful. He'd opened doors to me and helped me understand what teaching was taking place for teaching English as a second language to immigrants. I went up to Slough and sat in on classes. I went to Leeds and sat in on classes. I was learning. I was picking up material all the time. And that was during the language scheme. But sadly, he died that year. And the other one was Fred Morehouse died. And he was out raising money for a charity and collapsed and died. Wonderful man. I'm still friends with some of his children. They're on my Facebook. And I know that they're carrying the banners that he carried in his life, because he affected them to the best that you can ever do as a parent, to give them the standing stones to walk off into the world and try to make it a better world. I did Longcross in Lawrence Weston, and Hilary said, well, you were responsible for the council coming in. What has happened was they built flats, and they really didn't have substantial base to be on, and there was rising damp everywhere, and the walls weren't that thick. But they have been improved. I was active, as many of the people were, in the 1983 miners' strike. And some of us gave places for the people that were coming down from the mining areas to talk about what was going on up there. We gave them bed and breakfast, and off they went into Bristol. Another thing I remember, I was out in Henbury by the flats there. Oh, by the way, those flats, I haven't written that down in my notes, but I do remember those flats. They seem to have cancer clusters. When I was a councillor in that area, I knocked at doors, and then 4 or 5 years later, I was knocking at the same doors, and I was finding the people before had died, and the people that were in there were also dying of cancer. And that seemed absolutely unreal, that you were getting blocks of flats with cancer. So when I was on the health authority, I started reporting this and asking for research to be done so that we could actually look at the north side of Bristol. And some of those areas have fallout from Avonmouth and the Avonmouth industries. And I know that there was concerns about contamination that was coming through some of the stuff that belonged to ICI out there. So during my time as a councillor, I was picking up so much of the information of the city. I love the city, but the city, you have to watch what's going on in it all the time. Anyway, I was by these flats and I got locked out of my car. And somebody came out of the flats and showed me how to get into a locked car. So I was learning again. Years later, on the police authority, somebody got locked out of the car. And two of us came up instantly with the solution. And the chief constable said, "Who have I got on my committee that you know how to break into other people's cars?" That was quite funny. Yes, but I think those are the sort of people that should be on police committees, because at least we understood what was going on in the wide world for the rest of us. One of my housing cases was horrendous. It was in the St Anne's Broom Hill area. I went to this old man's house and he'd had a landlord for years and years and years who'd sold it to someone else. So he was having a new landlord to pay the rent to, and he had always paid his rent regularly. This landlord was causing him harassment. And about 4 weeks later, I went back again, and the landlord had taken out the staircase, had turned off all the central heating, had not, these old-fashioned terrace houses have a hallway you go into, and then it usually, the stairs go off the hallway, and to the left is a door. He'd taken out that wall as well, so that it was one big expanse of room downstairs, freezing cold, with no heating and nothing. So I called in Rod Lamb, I contacted Rod Lambourne, who was the Chief Environmental Health Officer at the time. This was after the other one had left, because he couldn't stand what I was finding in his housing stock. And Rod Lambourne, and I also had, the old man gave me the telephone number for his new landlord. So I rang it and a woman answered. And I said, "Look, we're going to take legal action against this landlord for what he's doing in this house to this old age pensioner." And she said, "Well, it won't make much difference to his life. He's in prison already." Turned out our Mr. Palmer was really a Mr. Cooper. And Mr. Cooper had been involved in gold robberies and had been melting it down near Bath. And this is what was called in those days the brink money. So I was able to go back to tell the Environmental Health Officer who the landlord was and that he was currently in Her Majesty's prison. It all tied up eventually with Lloyd's Bank in Bedminster. And after that, for years and years, housing and sometimes me found that we couldn't trace the landlord of properties. So what they were doing was ploughing their money into housing in Bristol. And it was a nice little earner, but they all had, we found the tenants were paying into the bank their rents as they should do, but that nobody could really trace who they were paying it to. I've had a really strange life. I never chose any of this. However, it's quite interesting. And Mr. Palmer died, didn't he, about maybe 10 years ago? Somebody shot him while he was getting in his car at a car park somewhere in Surrey in Kent. So I don't believe people should have co-operances, but at least we were able to start sorting out some of the housing that was going on in the city and the things that were going on in it. Now I'm going to tell you a story about a safe breaker. If you remember, I did a placement at Kingswood Schools, and part of this story is not mine, it's Andy Burkett's, but we put the two together eventually. Andy Burkett was a youth worker, and he covered Hartcliffe, and one of the dads there was known as one of the best safe breakers in the whole of the country. He'd been in the forces. He'd learned things about dynamite and things, and how to blow things up quietly rather than make a lot of noise. And his son wanted to follow in Dad's footsteps. And eventually, he brought home a safe to Dad in the back of his car. And Dad wasn't very pleased about having an illegal safe sitting in the back of the car outside the house. Now, this is where I come in, because I know that Dad went off after it had all been cleared up. And his son ended up in Kingswood Schools, and Dad said, well, at least he'll now become a professional rather than amateur, which is not the way you should think about going into youth prisons. But I had been working with gypsies and travellers, as some of you know. And I was out on the travellers' site, which is now the clearing place for rubbish for North Somerset. It's near Keynsham. It's their waste tip now. And I went out to an Irish group that were out there. I took a message out to them, and they were packing up like mad and trying to get off the site as fast as they possibly could. And I said, what's wrong? And they said, well, behind those mounds over there are some men, and they've got a safe, and they're actually trying to open it. And so they were trying to get out before they were had up for being part of a safe breaking group that were on that site. I know that that young lad sadly has a criminal convictions now and hasn't done any good whatsoever. And it's sad sometimes, the wasted life, because he probably had some brains that could be used for really constructive things, but that doesn't always happen. I also met someone else that knew about Andy Burkett. In fact, he was actually paranoid when he found out I knew Andy Burkett and wished he hadn't told me. But evidently, if the police cars in the city, South Bristol, had a plan and they could have got into trouble for it, he was the man that in 24 hours mended them and covered up the damage very, very quickly, so that they, as policemen, didn't get into trouble. I assume that all housing workers have this happen to them, that we're out in the community, we're meeting ordinary people, they're telling us stories, and in a way bragging about them and sometimes, which is sad, because if that is all your achievement, to bypass some of the sensible ways of living, then life can get very, very stressful. There was also someone In fact, this hit the papers eventually because they found him. And when families in Knoll West couldn't afford electricity or gas, their meters were removed and their system was taken off completely. And he, for a few bob, would go in and reconnect them, and they would then have free gas and electricity until the powers that be discovered it. So, yeah. I think they taught me a lot about what people do in all sorts of situations, and that morality really matters, as long as you can only be honest and truthful, providing you're not starving and you're not suffering from awful discriminations. Ethics are fine for people that are well off. We can afford them, but sometimes you can't when you're living the other side of the tracks. Yes, I visited a Hartcliffe flat, and I've never seen so many ornaments and things all over the floors, all over the thing. And the woman said, "Oh, we're just cleaning them before we put them back on the windowsill." And I looked at the windowsill and you couldn't get much on there anyway. So I assumed I'd walked into something rather dodgy. By the way, I wasn't getting direct answers or anything. Anyway, I looked at the damp, got the damp, told them that people will be coming to inspect it, assumed that they took the tip that the people that will be coming would not be like me, gullible, and hoped that they'd got rid of it all before they came round to have a look at the dam. Lots of the houses in Bristol, I think I have already told you in one or the other about the man that asked for or gave reduced rent to some of the renters in Bristol, providing they let them have sex or took photos of their naked children. And that I ended up having a meal provided by somebody from the tax office, when I actually told him where the second lot of books were that they could find to find out what his real income was, rather than the pretend income he was telling the tax office, which a woman had told me because she was so angry about what he was doing and what he, the sort of landlord he was. Sad, isn't it? It can be a bad world. It's all right, I got her rehoused away from him. But then I knew that there were lots of other people that couldn't get away from him, and I certainly couldn't find housing fast enough for all of them. But as I've told you, a lot of housing in Bristol, we couldn't find the owners to, and they weren't registered. There was also court cases eventually, although some of it you couldn't actually prove, that the banks and the solicitors and the building societies were all working together to commit some sort of fraud. There had to be something in it, because some of the housing in Bristol had 3 separate mortgages or 4 separate mortgages on them. In other words, someone had gone along and mortgaged the house and then remortgaged it with somebody else and remortgaged it somewhere else, and in the end disappeared completely because they got all the money that was supposed to pay for the house and pocketed it and disappeared into nowhere. It's amazing what people invent. And I wondered, yes, about guns. I didn't come across many guns, but there was one on the traveller's site that was right under where the big car park now is, near the Quaker Meeting House, near Central. There was a ministry building, that was quite tall. And then travellers went in on their car park. And I went in there one day to take a message in. And one of them had a gun, and the girl with me was absolutely appalled and frightened. And why wasn't I reporting it? And I thought, because I never do things like that openly, because I want to live for another day and go on doing my job, because this is not my job. But I had ways of telling the establishment things that they should know, and other times I just ignored things. But it depended on how dangerous it was to society as a whole. But there were moments when I realized that it could be tracked back to me. So I made sure that somehow or other it came out somewhere else. I hadn't disclosed it. Yes, there were moments when really difficult things happened. I went into prisons a lot when I was a counsellor. I went into Bay Hill. I went into the one that was, first of all, it was youth offending place. They were all marching around, all the young men. And I thought, well, it keeps their brains busy, but don't know what they'll be doing later. You're not skilling them in any way, so that they get a decent job at the other end of it. And then that turned into a woman's prison. So I've seen where people end up that go to prison. And I went to Puckle Church when it was just an ordinary prison, and then I went back to it on visits 2 or 3 times when it turned into a youth prison. I really think our prison system needs to be looked at. We need to ensure that the youngsters that are there are educated. Many of them can barely read or write and have very little wide knowledge of how the world functions. And also, many of them have been deprived of the one thing that's so important, which is love. And somebody to care for them, and somebody who actually asks them how they feel occasionally. When I represented Southmead, one of the environmental health officers for the city council, when he heard I got Southmead, said, now we know what's going on in there. So one of the first things I realized was that they had the interceptor radio system for intercepting police car messages for the whole of Bristol. So what was being arranged then by groups in Bristol was they kick up a fuss somewhere, get the police rushing there to sort something out that was really amiss, and then do what they really wanted to do somewhere else where they weren't being monitored and nobody knew about it. And I was on the police authority. I often wonder whether Southmead worked out I was on the police authority. It was a bit worrying at times. But one of the things I encouraged and which took place was the police got a completely and utterly brand new system, radio system, that couldn't be hacked. So that at least the information that was coming in was then the correct information that should have existed in the first place. There was, in Trowbridge Road, it was all over the papers afterwards, a drug dealer. And the police didn't seem to be able to pin it down to him, partly because his building was like Fort Knox. If you went into the building, you went through one door into the porch, you then had to stop and before you went through another door. Both were locking behind you. And when eventually the Bristol City Housing Department put in, they had an empty property opposite. And they put 2 of the members of staff in there to monitor what was going on. It was a nice little business. People were coming from all over the city to buy drugs was there. And they eventually had all the information they wanted for a police raid. He had interceptors on his toilets so that if he put down the drugs down the toilet, if there was a police raid and there was no drugs found in the property, then it was caught in the system so he could just break in and get it out again. So he didn't lose any drugs anytime there was a raid on. And he went to prison. But sadly, his children then, the council repossessed the building, the house. And his children, he did really want this. I don't like this because what happened was they moved in with an elderly relative and were running drugs again. It's just another part of the fraud. It was the family's occupation, and that was the way they did their living, and that was all they knew. And that's the moment when I think we all fail as a society sometimes to pick up that the strength is to try to direct these youngsters that come from backgrounds like that in another direction, and to give them the abilities to survive at some other job. The secretary of South Mead Labour Party at that time was called Colin, and he worked in the electrical industry, and there was no equalities and correct procedures in those days. You either got a job on the nod or you didn't get a job at all. But he was picking youngsters who were showing signs of going for criminal behavior and got them jobs and apprenticeships and got them working. And it worked. And that's what we should get back to, is looking for apprenticeships to get these youngsters so that they got pride in I do something beneficial that's not illegal. And the other day I was talking to someone and saying, well, can't you go to an evening class? We no longer have evening classes. We ought to have evening classes. It was how working people could actually go and get educated in their evenings or at other times. There's an awful lot of work we could do. And I found out, by the way, that a lot of drug dealing was going on from older people's homes, and they were being bullied and had to have it in other parts of the city. It was something that obviously got on the grapevine. So you wanted to know about how much I know about what goes on. And I'm living in Stockwood now, where the crime rate's going up again, at the edge of the city. And I know it is in other parts of the city. And I don't know how we are actually going to get, with this government, some of the sensible solutions that we need. The old-fashioned apprenticeships, they were hard, they were vicious at times. Some of the dirty tricks they played on those apprentices were really bad. They might have been funny for some people, they weren't for everybody. But we need to get pride back in the jobs. And that isn't there now. And it isn't. And I am sure some of this came out of the war. I keep thinking about the fact that they opened the prisons. Some of them probably made a good life for themselves in the army and decided never to go back to what they'd been. But others learnt ways of living that perhaps affected the crime rate in this country for many generations afterwards. I hope friends could take all that. I never chose my life. I walked in once on a gypsy site and they were being accused of taking lead. And I walked in on them down by the cut in Bristol. About a month later, there was all the piles of lead that they'd been accused of taking. So I knew that they'd actually done it. But it's the moment you've got to choose what you tell the police or what you tell the establishment, and whether it will actually result in any constructive way of turning people's lives around so they didn't have to do that sort of thing ever again. Right, I'm stopped. That was a bit heavy, I apologise.
Do not apologise, Jenny. I found that fascinating, and one of the names which you gave at your start of your discussion was a word called skippers, and I hadn't heard that word since I was working in community work in London, but I remember it very well. But less of me. Questions and comments to Jenny, please, friends.
You can all unmute yourselves.
Very interesting, Jenny. Thank you.
Yeah, great.
Jenny, I wanted to say how absolutely fascinating that was. And I have this vision of there being a wanted poster out for you somewhere.
Yeah, I did have attacks on the house. That's why this house has cameras around it. In fact, that was it was myself and I think it was Celia Lukin was the other one. There was no Rosemary. She and I, when we were having phone calls in the middle of the night to wake us up and threats, and I've had bomb threats at the house and all sorts of things. And I did 1471, found out the number, told the police, and actually it was a telephone box opposite Avonmouth police station they were ringing from. Because they said it was Rosemary and me that actually did take, instead of just slamming down the phone and going back to sleep, I decided to take some action. But we've got to think about the world we're in. We've got to really, really think about what we do about the next generations.
That's the tower blocks. I remember those also because they were built by some of the tower blocks in London were built by really dodgy builders, you know, who hadn't a thought about who was living in them. It was how much money they could make and run away quickly before it was found out.
Yeah. There was one in Barton Hill where a kid went down the waste chute, and what saved his life was somebody had illegally put in a mattress halfway down. He fell on the mattress and it didn't move. I mean, oh yeah, there's another story. Do you want another one? I've forgotten this one. It was quite interesting. Went into the tower block by the ring road in Bristol, the big one, where most of the Somalians now live. And it was a family with 6 children, God knows how many floors up. And I managed to get them an offer and put them in my car and take them out to see the offer, which was in Eastville. And then went back to outside St. Werburgh's school. So we picked up the children who were at school to add to my car before I took the mum and dad and the kids back to the flat. And dad was, and a mate, I don't know whether they realized that I was listening, were working out a job that they were going to do, pinching a car. I was thinking, this is getting too heavy. I'm into housing. I'm not into this sort of thing. Anyway, they moved out to Eastville. They got a 4-bedroom. They had a garden, and I hope those kids got a better life out there.
A little story, not quite on the same thing. We were talking about knowing how to unpick a flat. I was driving across America once and wanted to understand how people lived in the desert. And I picked up a hitchhiker right on the edge of the Mojave Desert. And we took quite some time to cross it. He was very knowledgeable. He'd been in the Marines, and we stopped off for a night. And stayed in a little hotel, you know, on the road. And in the morning, I was meditating, and I got out of my finished meditating, got up, went out to look at the car, and this guy was standing beside the car, and all the doors were open. And he'd been a Marine, and I sort of looked at him, and he looked at me, and he'd been in the intelligence in the Marines. And he said, when you're in intelligence, there must be no boundaries. It was quite clear that, you know, his training allowed him to come and go as he pleased. So you seem to have some of that resourcefulness, Jenny.
Did you ever come across something which I found quite horrifying, you know, on the bonfires that were around these places, which were old bomb sites of the Second World War? You came across these ladies and gentlemen who were drinking what I was told was called red biddy. Horrible stuff. I don't know if you ever come across that. No, this was raw red wine, very cheap red wine in half the bottle. And what was it? A chemical in the other half of the bottle, you know, and it was just gut ruining stuff, you know. You think, ooh, you know, it was quite horrible, you know, and you know, they died eventually of it. But you know, it was another way of life which I really hadn't a clue about, but was there. As you say, that type of thing yourself it's the way people live, you know. And
I was, one of my talks, I talked about when I was in the forces and that I lived in a wooden hut. There's a picture of the wooden hut. All right. That was one of my homes. I'm sure God was having jokes with me. I was put into situations sometimes, even in Cyprus, where most people would have run away.
friends, I think we have come to a natural end to today's discussion. May I again thank Jenny for a very interesting and thought-provoking discussion, and no doubt we will have more things in the past. Patsy, may I be so bold as to ask you where we will be next week?
Well, next week we will have Dr. Julia Bailey with us from University College London, and her area of expertise is gender, and she'll be discussing the concepts of male, female, other, yeah. So I think that's all the information I've got, but it does sound very illuminating. I'm sure it'll be helpful.